Good morning, church. This is Pastor Charlie, and we're continuing in the book of Jude. And today we're going to start in verse 11. And I'm going to read a few verses down, and I don't know how far we'll get today, but it says this: Woe to them, for they walk in the way of Cain and abandon themselves for the sake of gain to Balaam's error, and perished in Korah's rebellion. These are hidden reefs at your love feast, as they feast with you without fear, shepherds feeding themselves, waterless clouds swept along by winds, fruitless trees in late autumn, twice dead, uprooted, wild waves of the sea, casting up the foam of their own shame, wandering stars for whom the gloom of darkness has been reserved forever. Jude's not mincing words about these people. Now, to remind you, these people are certain ones that have crept in unnoticed. They're ungodly. They pervert the grace of God into sensuality, and they deny the only master who bought them. They rely on their dreams, so their visions more than they're relying on Scripture. They defile the flesh, that's sexual immorality. They give themselves to sin. They reject authority. They are not listening to Scripture or other teachers, and they blaspheme the glorious ones. What they don't understand about the spiritual world, they blaspheme, and they are destroyed. And now Jude says, woe to them. It's one of these woes that come through the prophets, or like of the woes that Jesus pronounced on the Pharisees and Sadducees. So woe to them. Why woe to them? For they walk in the way of Cain. Now, what was the way of Cain? In Cain's offering before God, God corrected him, and Cain, instead of taking the correction, turned to anger. And when warned that sin is crouching at your door, embraced the sin instead of fought it. In other words, they were worshipers who allowed sin to gain a foothold, and after gaining a foothold, committed a grievous sin and murdered his brother. And they abandoned themselves for the sake of gain to Balaam's error. Balaam was a prophet of God who, for money, was going out and prophesying. And he was bought by this king to prophesy a curse on Israel, but the Lord wouldn't let him do it. And so Balaam leaves, blessing Israel and not this king. And the king, therefore, withheld all the riches. And so Balaam found a way around it. He said, okay, king, I can't curse them, but if you will entice them with women and get their men to commit sexual immorality with these women, then God himself will turn on them, which of course worked, and he did. And then Balaam ended up being paid but dying with this king, as this king fought against Israel. And so for gain, they turned a blessing from God into an avenue of leading them into sin, so that God would then curse them. And so these people are giving themselves over to sin like Cain, and they are leading others into sin, so that God's punishment is coming upon the church. And then they perished in Korah's rebellion. These false teachers are going and standing against the leaders of the church, standing against those who would, in Korah's rebellion, they stood against Moses. Now, these were people that were wandering in the desert. They were already told by God that they were going to perish in the desert. And then they rose up against Moses to lead the people in a way that God had not said. So in other words, these are people who are already in rebellion against the Lord, and then now they are rebelling against the leadership of the church. And Jude doesn't mince words about these people. They give themselves over to sin, they lead other people into sin, and they rebel against the leaders of the church. And listen to what Jude calls them. He says, these are hidden reefs at your love feast. A hidden reef is something when you're on your boat and you think things are fine, all of a sudden it takes your boat out and you lose your cargo and people drown. These are hidden reefs. These are dangerous things that are going on in the midst of your church. They're hidden reefs at your love feast that feast with you without fear. They are shepherds. They say they're shepherds. They want to lead, who are feeding themselves instead of feeding the flock. They're waterless clouds, swept along by the wind, fruitless trees in late autumn, twice dead and uprooted, wild waves of the sea, casting up the foam of their own shame, wandering stars for whom the gloom of darkness has been reserved forever. In other words, they are useless in the church for good, and they are only going to bring about evil, their own sin, and they're going to entice others and lead them into sin. In other words, these are leaders that stands against the leaders of the church, and they teach that people, it's okay for you to sin. It's okay for you to fall into sexual immorality and whatnot. And they're doing it all for their own benefit, so that these people that they're releasing into sin will give them money, like in Balaam's error. In other words, church, we need to be discerning about the leaders of our church and who we're going to allow to teach us. Because if they're allowing sin in the church, it's not a good thing. And there's woes that come about on them. We'll continue on Thursday, and we'll talk a little bit more about kind of what's going to happen to these leaders. Okay, church? We'll talk to you Thursday.